talk. Sorry, the Katie Yates voice.
Oh, yeah.
I'm here with Katie Yates from Maine Outdoors. Or what do you call the podcast?
Fishing Game Changers.
I'm here with Katie Yates, and we are bringing to you Fishing Game Changers.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, Lee. My name is Katie Yates, and this is the final episode of Season 5 of the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife's podcast, Fishing Game Changers. Throughout this series, I have explored everything about Maine's most majestic mammal, the moose. I've learned all about how we study moose to understand the health of the herd and the winter tick issue, and MDIFW's moose biologist Lee Cantor's proposed adaptive management study. If you're just tuning in, you really should start at the beginning, but here is a real quick recap. Maine's moose population is stable in its core range. We know this from a survey to count moose conducted by MDIFW biologists via helicopter. We also know the distribution of calves, cows, and bulls determined through another aerial survey. And for several years, Lee Cantor has been fitting cow and calf moose with GPS collars and tracking them. If the collared moose dies, Lee finds the moose and performs a necropsy to determine the cause of death. Most often, this was caused by a winter tick.
This relationship between winter tick and moose is decades old and has been looked at for decades. In fact, there's two Canadian authorities who've basically their careers were studying winter tick and moose. And nobody would look at winter ticks without thinking, what can we do about winter tick, right? So there's lots of problems here because you're talking about a tick, again, that has one host and lives for a year. And it starts that, they start as egg mass in the woods. And then when those eggs hatch, the larvae in mass crawl up on bushes and wait to ambush a moose, and then they're on the moose the whole time. So somehow, if you were going to kill these ticks, you got a load of problems. One is that our core range is 16,000 square miles. That's a lot of moose country. Number two, it's like anything else, and there's some parallels with COVID-19, which is, you can inoculate one person, that's not going to do much for you. You can do 10, that's still not. You can do 100, sorry, buddy, you're not going to get anywhere. The only success is if you can do it everywhere and really get a huge proportion. And so then the question is, well, you're going to kill winter ticks, you're going to either do it on the ground or you're going to do it on the moose. And we've got all kinds of people advising us for years. And that's great because it shows you that the people of the state are very concerned about the situation. And we've obviously done a more than adequate job in informing the public about winter tick. Even though, and this year especially, there's certainly moose have resilience even in the face of winter tick, which is not a bad thing.
We know that dense moose populations can lead to the proliferation of disease and parasites such as winter tick. Moose populations are very dense in their core range. To better understand the relationship between moose densities and winter ticks in Maine, Lee is proposing an adaptive management study where moose hunting permits will be increased in half of one wildlife management district. Throughout the course of the study, Lee will continue to collar moose and monitor their health. After the study is complete, Lee can make a determination. Does thinning the herd increase cow and calf survival and break the winter tick cycle?
There's a thing out there called density dependence, which is a biological term that means that when you have a lot of animals in one place living together, that a lot of things can happen to that and to those animals. And usually an animal or a population that's affected by having too many animals usually starts to see an increase in disease and parasites and a loss of productivity. And that's what we're seeing here. And, so the school of thought for decades has been if you want to protect your moose from dying, like young overwintering calves from dying from winter tick, you would try to lower the population level. And this is really a difficult concept for people because, number one, we've had winter tick taking so many calves, greater than 50%, and that's in that western part for 6 out of 7 years. That's a lot. Dying from winter ticks is not a pretty thing. Some of those calves are lingering for a long period of time before they die, and just wasting away essentially. And some of them have a more abrupt where they tip over and they're gone. That's not a happy or healthy situation to think about. And honestly, moose and moose hunting in its best form is something that is it's a renewable resource. It's something that can be utilized. Hunting is something that's accepted by the majority of Mainers. People deer hunt, they bear hunt, they turkey hunt, they bird hunt. People love to fish. It's the way, and moose hunting is part of that too. And we already talked about how we have very conservative hunts. So there's lots of good evidence and lots of good science, including science done right here in our state, that points to the idea that when you have a moose population that is too dense, and you're seeing an increase in disease and an increase in parasites like winter tick and lungworm, and you have moderate to high moose densities, that if you could bring those densities down, perhaps you can break the tick cycle. And so ultimately what you would see here, and this brings us to the idea of what we call adaptive management, is, we want to see if we apply pressure to the moose hunt in a small portion of the core range. And again, I had mentioned that our hunting is very conservative, so we increase permits in one small area to purposely bring that moose population down, to lower that moose population. We can examine and measure over time whether that will break the tick cycle or not. So here's a circumstance where you need to learn and understand those dynamics by actually doing that, by actually taking a management action now and not years from now, but doing it now and evaluating that every year to say, this is having an effect or this is not having an effect. And that's an adaptive approach. And here we have a situation that's ideal in Maine where we can take a portion of one of our very large units, put a lot more hunting pressure on the cows, lower that population, and measure, are there less ticks? Are there less calves dying from winter tick? And are we increasing how productive those cows are over time? And that's one of the things the department has proposed for 2021, with a lot of good science behind it.
In an earlier episode, we reviewed the permit process for Maine's moose hunt. But just as a refresher, Maine's moose hunt is closely monitored and controlled through a lottery system. Each year, the department receives tens of thousands of moose hunt applications, and only a few thousand are drawn for the hunt. For example, last year we received over 65,000 total applications for the moose hunt, and we issued a little over 3,000 permits. As a reference, we estimate to have about 60,000 individual moose in Maine, give or take.
Moose in North America, it's a very diverse set of circumstance across from eastern to western North America and all. But right next door to the area where we're proposing this adaptive unit is the province of Quebec. And, I'm not suggesting that we manage our moose like Quebec, but they essentially have a system where they hunt moose like we hunt deer. So every year you go hunting, right, for moose. Right across the border at the same latitude, if you looked at those where our adaptive unit would be, and you look at Quebec, their level of harvest is so high above us. They basically in the same size area of our District 4, in some years they'll harvest as many as we do across the entire state. And they do that at a population level that's about 4 times lower than our population. Now, there's other things that come with that, which is they have success rates that look like our deer success rates. They likely do not have the mature bulls that we have, but everybody goes hunt, right? Now, again, I'm not suggesting that, and that's not where we're headed, but it gives some people room to think about where we are currently with our level of harvest versus something right next door. Literally, you and I could stand and like we are right now and talk to each other from that area, and yet worlds apart in how those two moose populations are managed. And so that always gives me some, level of contrast. That's always very interesting to look at, because all along the southern Quebec, south of the St. Lawrence, moose harvest is much more intense at lower population levels than their adjacent units here in Maine.
The number of permits we issue in each wildlife management district varies year to year. The number is based on the WMD's management goals and are in part developed through public input and obviously Lee's observations through the aerial surveys and harvest data each year.
In general, the process is to go through the rulemaking through our advisory council, which is the same process that is done every year for the annual allocation of moose permits, and it's a 3-step process. So, the department, I think, has been doing a really excellent job trying to inform and educate and get out the word about moose and winter tick and where we stand and all the things that are going on. Obviously, we've talked about this already. We're 8 years of GPS collaring moose and research, lots of good science, aerial surveys. We're really in a place that, 15 years ago, we certainly never were. And that's to the benefit of Mainers and people who are concerned and interested in the wildlife resource. So it would go to the 3-step rulemaking process, which I believe starts in March. And by June, that would be all wrapped up and we'd implement during the fall hunt.
Lee makes a recommendation for how many permits to issue per wildlife management district to the department's advisory council. To get a better sense of how all this works, I turned to Crystal Theriault, the department's legislative liaison.
My name is Crystal Theriault, and I am the assistant to the commissioners, and I'm the legislative liaison for the agency. And just a little bit about what I do with the agency is I follow all the legislative process and ensure that we're staying on top of the bills that impact IF&W. I work with mainly our directors to provide testimony and, talk to the public about whether we support or oppose a bill. And then work with constituents and the legislators and the governor's office on our positions and tracking everything. And then internally with our rulemaking process, I assist the commissioners and the directors. In my off time, I'm very interested in the outdoors, and actually I'm very passionate about fly fishing, hunting. I deer hunt, turkey hunt, grouse hunt, duck hunt on occasion, and love to do that with my kids and my family. I love to garden, play guitar, but I am very passionate about the outdoors, and most of our staff are like that though. Yeah, so it makes work a little more fun because we actually live what we work too. So just talking briefly, often when I educate our own staff about the legislative and rulemaking process, I tell them I'm going to give them a quick civic lesson like you would get in elementary school, but we often forget that there are 3 branches of government. We have the legislative branch, which enacts laws, that's the legislature. We have the judicial branch, which they interpret the laws, so that's the Attorney General's office, and then the court system. And then the executive branch is where most state agencies fall within, and Inland Fisheries and Wildlife does as well. The executive branch is actually responsible for executing the laws and interpreting them, educating the public on them, and then enforcing them. So we have an enforcement branch, which is the Maine Warden Service. So the difference between a rule and a law is really where it comes from. There's 2 different processes, but they're enforced the same way. So a rule does have the same force and weight as law does. If there should be a conflict between the 2, then law will always prevail. So a law comes from the legislative process, and a rule comes from an internal department's rulemaking process. But a rulemaking process is governed by law in a place called Title V. So just a little bit on the difference between the legislative and rulemaking process. With the legislative process, it's a 2-year, they call it a 2-year biannual session. In the first session, it's non-emergency, so there's a lot of bills that are proposed. There's a lot of different ideas floating around, and really anybody can go to a legislator and ask them to put a bill in for them. Whether they do or not is up to the legislator. Every state agency has the ability through the governor's office to propose bills as well, and we do most every year. So if we feel that there's something that needs to be changed, or it's outdated, or we're not effectively enforcing something, or it's not clear, then often we'll have different proposals that we put through the legislature. And so that normally starts in January and runs for about 4 to 6 months, depending on the year. And the process is meant to be a public process. So every bill will have a public hearing, and anybody can testify if they're interested. They would have to monitor the date and time and be able to, this year it's a little different. They'd have to sign in or register to be on a Zoom meeting, and they can speak and express their opinion about something, or they can send written testimony in. So the legislative committee, and there is a committee for every state agency that oversees the types of laws that are passed. And so Inland Fisheries and Wildlife is no different. We have an IF&W committee, and those legislators listen to the different bill proposals, and they listen to the constituents and the public at large and try to weigh the pros and cons, and then from there they discuss it and have work sessions, and they may or may not pass a bill into law. And it's much more complicated than that, and it's a much longer process, but from the committee it would go to both the House of Representatives and the Senate for votes, and then the governor would either have to sign off on it or let it become law without signature, or she may veto it if she feels strongly opposed to something. Mm-hmm. So that's a very short explanation of the legislative process, but we have a pretty heavy involvement with the bills that impact us, and the rulemaking process is very similar, but it's controlled more internally by the department. So with our rulemaking process, we have an advisory council comprised of 10 members that represent all 16 counties of the state. They have to sort of apply for the position. It's a 3-year term, and they can decide to re-up the term, or they can be asked to do that, and they can only serve 2 back-to-back terms, so a 6-year period. They have to be confirmed by our IF&W committee at the legislature, and normally they have some vested interest in the agency, or they're active in the outdoors, or they may have some sort of background that really makes them somewhat qualified to speak on some of the issues. And a lot of their responsibility really is to answer questions to the public, so they can be another resource to people in their area, to answer questions, or just be sort of a conduit to the agency. If they can't answer the question, they'll get in touch with a staff member that can. They can also take concerns or comments from their area and bring them into the meetings and talk about the concerns that their folks have on the proposals that are coming before the council. So that's kind of their responsibility, and we ask that they attend local meetings, the different sportsmen's clubs, and try to be involved with their community that way to represent the agency.
Yeah.
Normally, if there's a rulemaking change, one of our staff puts it forward, and there's sort of an internal process for vetting and review. We actually have 27 rule chapters. The agency has 27 rule chapters currently. each chapter of rule is a document that is applied to a certain topic or certain area. So for example, our chapter 16 is all hunting related. And then, like our chapter 2 is all fishing related. There's quite a process with that, and the public can be involved and actually petition the department. They can petition the commissioner to bring a rule proposal forward. And if that occurs, then the commissioner has to have a public hearing on it, and it goes through sort of a 3-step process. And by that, I mean it's kind of like a 90-day process. And so we introduce the idea to the advisory council, and then at step 2 in the second month, it's during the public comment period normally, and we most often have a public hearing where people can come and speak, or they can submit written testimony, and we track all that. And then at step 3 in the third month, the commissioner looks at everything, kind of weighs it, and decides whether she wants to move forward with it and have the advisory council vote. And as long as the advisory council consents to something, then the commissioner can pass a rule, or she can choose not to. If people want to get involved with the law rulemaking process, I would strongly encourage them to sign up on the legislative website under the IF&W committee. They can email the clerk and ask to be put on a distribution list so they're notified when there's public hearings or work sessions. And this year, with the pandemic, everything's going to be broadcast and streamed live, and then you can watch them later if you're interested. But there'll be Zoom meetings and YouTube channels that you can actually watch the hearings and work sessions live. And it's a little bit different if you actually want to testify. You have to go through a quick registration process for the particular bill that you want to testify on, but you will be given the opportunity to speak live on camera, or you can send in written testimony. So we encourage people to get involved if they're passionate about something, rather than complaining after the fact. Do what you can to be a part of the process, when something's on the table. The same is true for the rulemaking process. People can be involved. Anybody can come to the meetings. We're now doing them virtually on Teams, and people can sign in and listen, or they can testify if it's a public hearing day. And those opinions are all taken into consideration. One current topic that the public is very interested in is what's going to be proposed as the adaptive moose hunt. And our moose biologist, Lee Kantar, spoke to our legislative committee about the rule proposal that's going to be coming up next month. And if people want to get involved, they can certainly speak at a public hearing. But the reason this is going to rulemaking is that the commissioner has the authority to change the moose bag limits per a WMD, and she can do that in rule. So we don't just pick and choose whether we want to put something in rule or in statute. The commissioner has the authority to regulate the moose hunt under the statute, but she has more specific authority in rule. So because of the detail and the things that the biological staff are proposing, we're going through a rulemaking process. Lee will do a presentation to the advisory council similar to the one that he provided to the legislature, and we only did that really to make them aware that we were going to the advisory council with this proposal. And so at step 1, he's going to brief them on the work that they've been doing in the studies and why they've come to this point, and then what he sees in this adaptive moose hunt, and what they hope to gain from the information when they're done. Mm-hmm. And then the advisory council will end up voting on it, and the commissioner will either be able to pass it or not.
It may shock you, but I am a real person, and I do read the comments on the department's social media posts. There are many out there who have suggested some alternative solutions for solving the winter tick problem in Maine. For those out there who think we should fit all the moose in Maine with tick collars, or release a horde of guinea fowl in the North Maine woods, or think turkeys are somehow to blame, this is for you. a quick frequently asked questions session with Lee Cantor. So one of the questions that I see frequently is, why can't we use guinea hens or possums to control the tick population?
Yeah.
That's one of my favorites because
Yeah.
I have guinea hens. So
Well, I mean, again, I think we really do actually appreciate the fact that the public is thinking on this and saying, well, what about this as an option? Unfortunately, with something like guinea hens and opossums, the introduction of an animal, let alone an exotic or potentially invasive or non-native, whatever you want to call it, just brings up a whole host of other problems. And, guinea hens, for one, I mean, again, we're talking about 16,000 square miles. I'm assuming, and I know nothing about guinea hens, but I'm assuming guinea hens are not from Maine. Right? They're probably, I don't know if they're African or what,
They're
but they're
African.
probably, so I would make some assumptions that they're warm weather species and that they don't dig the cold too well. And, frankly, the core range of moose in Maine is a tough area for a white-tailed deer, let alone, a little bird, and I don't even know what they eat, but, if they think they're going to just pick ticks on a moose, are they going to pick them off a live moose on their back? Or no, they're going to pick them off plants and things like that. I mean, it's just, I don't see how that would work. But, again, the bottom line is the department's not going to be favorable for spending money to introduce species that are not native to this. And that's the same thing with possums. Possums are making their way north, likely because of climate change. But you're not going to trap and transfer a bunch of possums across the moose range, which is such a vast area with a place that's probably pretty inhospitable to possums. I'd be surprised how they'd even do. I mean, really. So then you wind up spending a bunch of money for nothing.
Right.
You're not going to get anything from it. And there's some good predators out there.
Oh yeah.
I mean, there's goshawks, there's owls, there's coyotes, there's foxes, there's all kinds of things like martins and fishers, and nobody to, so I mean that's a whole nother thing. And the fact is, we do have native birds that eat ticks, winter ticks, gray jays. We've documented, we've seen them on moose picking off winter ticks. What's a couple gray jays going to do with 50,000 ticks?
Right.
They're not going to make a dent in it. Is the answer to that? So.
Right. I don't know. Is the myth that turkeys spread ticks? Do people apply that to winter tick as well?
I don't know. I mean, it's, if you've ever followed a wild turkey, foraging through the field, it's like a tick and insect killer. I mean, it's amazing what it can do. So if anything, it's a benefit in the fact that it's a tick killer. That's actually your natural tick killer. The problem is that, wild turkeys are not exactly doing great up in the interior of zones 1, 2, 4, and 5, which is the big part of our core range.
So why can't we just put flea and tick collars or some type of flea and tick medicine or something like we do with our cats and dogs?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we mentioned this before, but, flea and tick medicine, or let's just say tick medicine, for an animal the size of a moose is problematic. Again, when we put tick medicine on our dogs, my dog gets a monthly oral medication that I give to that dog every month. There's no way you're going to give a oral pill to a moose every month. I mean, I don't even know how to begin with that. So if you're going to give one dose to an animal that's, let's just say a calf. A calf is 400 pounds right there. That's an incredibly bigger amount than your Newfoundland dog, right? And you're going to do a one-shot deal. The province of Quebec and New Brunswick have been working on a moose project where, in order to do a scientific study, they want to start, let's say they call it 100 moose. They wanted to try to kill ticks off of half of those moose so that they knew during the course of their study that they could rule out ticks on those half. And the first year they did that, what they were going to do is put the stuff on the moose and then capture those 100 moose again and look and see how it did. It didn't work. So, I mean, it's just, and again, we can talk about the fact that how many moose are you going to do this on? The sheer number of moose that you need to do this on is crazy. and I'm sure it would be in the thousands. And to do that on calves, which are the ones taking the biggest heat, and to capture them, and I don't know. I'm sorry. When I start to think about it, it boggles my mind how we would do that. And frankly, to do that for wildlife that I love, when there's so many other things going on out in this world that needs our attention, and the costs are just astronomical.
And I feel like I just know from my dogs that flea and tick medicine the ticks adapt to the medicine.
Yeah.
So by spreading it out widely throughout the state over time, they would become resistant to it, right? I would think.
Yeah, I mean, it's the whole thing. It's just, and again, how do you give it to the animal is a significant point. And people talk about bait sites and salt licks and all this, but again, we're talking about thousands of square miles and many animals to do, and I don't see it.
And controlling the amount for each of them. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, those are great points. Exactly. I mean, it's like, you put out something and you can't guarantee an equitable share for every animal that's there, let alone a cow, calf, and bull and all that. And it's just, it's a nightmare.
Yeah. So why don't we just spray insecticides and kill them all that way?
Yeah. Well, and that goes back to the fact that the majority of the moose woods is owned by private companies, and any kind of insecticide that would be put out there would I think would probably kill just about everything. I mean, you can do this, you can get stuff for ticks for your own, backyard, and you can read about all the things to defend yourself against ticks in your own property, and then you think about that at the scale that would need to be done, and just the fact, I mean, not only are you affecting insects, but you're affecting water quality. I mean, this is a huge thing, and it's just not something that biologically, ecologically really would make any sense.
Right. And then burning. So
Yeah.
I know that prescribed burns sometimes are a solution. Is that maybe the area is just too great?
Yeah, I mean, controlled burns are something that they've talked about, but again, we're dealing with private lands who are in a business that they're growing trees, and the type of burning that would need to be done to kill ticks are the type of burns that are likely going to kill small trees that they're trying to grow. And so it's counterproductive to private industry, commercial forest lands. And then it would need to be done at a scale that would actually impact ticks and moose range, which is, again, huge. And, it's hard to wrap your head around, the size of moose range and how big it really is.
If you ask Lee Cantor, he will tell you, moose are beautiful. Moose are Maine. And the department is dedicated to making sure the moose herd in Maine is as strong and healthy as it can be, so future generations can enjoy this majestic, beautiful, iconic creature. If you want to learn more about moose in Maine, the Adaptive Management Study, winter tick, or review past seasons of Fish and Game Changers, head over to emmyfishwildlife.com/changers. If your favorite listening app is the Apple Podcast app, leave us a rating and let us know what you think. To stay current with the department's programs and efforts, follow us on Facebook and Instagram.